Now, most of the people died in the very same city in which they were born. There is always an envy of wealth and power. Only the very rich can afford to travel, and only the healthiest and most robust of those would really care to venture out of the relative safety of their home cities for the sake of some risky adventures in what had come to be known as the landscape. When Evans was much younger, he and Lydia took the subway to the very edge of the city, where they were required to show their government-issued permit to leave through one of the closely monitored pedestrian gates. When asked the purpose of his departure, Evans glanced at his wife, then returned his gaze to the uniformed officer who monitored the gate and said, "Outdoor recreation." With a frown, the guard studied them for a moment, looked once more at their permit, which he still held in his hand. In another moment, he handed the permit back to Evans and said, "This expires in 5 days. See that you're back before then." The friend had warned them in advance that they would need to take a map of the outlying region they wished to explore along with a compass, since cell phone reception beyond the walls of the city was either unreliable or non-existent. Rumor had it, their friend went on to say, that the government operated devices which jammed cell phone reception beyond the limits of the city to discourage people from visiting the landscape. But why would they do that? Lydia had asked. Well, some say merely to make such trips as unattractive as possible, their friend replied. But that still begs the question, he went on. In my view, the government wants to minimize the flow of people for the sake of heightening social stability. With the aid of their map, they soon found the remnants of a state highway, which had once been used before the increasingly turbulent windstorms had rendered both land and air travel impossible. They walked for a few miles along the empty highway, the ramparts of the city gradually diminishing from view, lost behind a reddish-brown haze. "I'm surprised this road is in such good shape," said Evans. "The winds scour everything, John. That's why you don't see any weeds growing up through the cracks in the pavement." "Yes, of course. And just look at the land, nothing but dirt and rocks." "Well, the winds rip off layer after layer of soil right down to the bedrock." "From here it's easy to see why agriculture was driven underground." "Between the winds and the floods, there wasn't much choice," she said. "But it's given you plenty of work building those underground farms." "I'm much happier working on the residential structures. At least with them, we're defeating the winds, preventing them from driving us entirely underground. Humankind emerged from caves, Lydia. It's not our destiny to return to them." "I've always loved you for your optimism," she said. "You know that, don't you?" She glanced at him with a wry smile and was about to tell him that he was lucky to have her, someone to lighten his more gloomy turns of mind, when she let out a startled, "Oh!" "What is it?" he said, alarmed. "I saw something moving out there, John." "Well, that's impossible. It was running, then it disappeared." "What do you mean, it?" "I don't know what it was. A dog, maybe." For a moment they shared an anxious, bewildered look, which Evans finally ended by saying, "Whatever you saw, there's bound to be more of them, but I can't imagine how any animal can exist out here. In any case, we'd better get back." Later, whenever they spoke of their aborted hike, their friends would react in disbelief. "But everyone knows that all the land animals have been wiped out by the winds." "But we saw something, or rather Lydia saw something," Evans would say in return. He hadn't thought about that hike in years. Lydia had seen something he'd been convinced of that, but no one else could be convinced. Their friends had chalked up the sighting to the eeriness of the landscape itself. A barren, desolate waste, devoid of any life apart from a few species of ground-hugging vegetation. Evans spent close to 2 hours walking through the park. Now and again he'd pass someone going in the opposite direction and they would exchange a friendly nod. Evans was always surprised at how little use the parks received. He had visited a few other parks in various parts of the city over the years and met the same situation at each of them as well. Those who did come to the parks were often young families with small children, or elderly couples, or late middle-aged single men, or far less often, single women. There were times when Evans thought he would like to find another woman to live with, perhaps even to marry. In a few months he would turn 50. He wasn't that old yet. In a few months, but he'd been alone for over 4 years now. During the windstorm season, when he was furloughed from all outdoor work and did not have an immediate hand in any subterranean construction, he suffered from inactivity and loneliness. But day followed upon day, and eventually he was busy once again, working with his colleagues once more on the construction of yet another residential tower, or underground shopping mall, park, sports facility, or agricultural complex. Which reminded him he still needed to reserve a racquetball court for his Thursday match with Armando. The two men played with their usual competitive verve. After each of them won a pair of games, and after a telepathic look of shared exhaustion, they nodded and returned to the locker room. They showered, and while getting dressed once more in their street clothes, Evans said, "After we leave the sports facility, I've got to go to the government office to file for a permit to visit the landscape." Armando gave his friend an odd look and said with a note of irony, "I know they're terribly slow about such things, but the storm season still has a few months to go. Aren't you jumping the gun a bit?" "Lydia and I went several years ago. Can I interest you in going, Armando?" "Not my cup of tea, I'm afraid. Besides, I could never convince Patricia that the landscape is a safe environment, even when the winds are in their doldrums." "Ah, a city girl through and through." "Oh, that's right. I can hardly get her to take a walk with me in the courtyard. She has a very strong aversion to the outdoors." "Well, I plan to take my camera along. You can invite me over for dinner some night after my hiking tour, and I'll bring along a thumb drive loaded with pictures." "Well, she'll probably want to make spaghetti." "Wonderful. I love your wife's spaghetti." Obtaining a permit for his excursion out through the landscape proved to be far more difficult than on that previous occasion years ago when he and Lydia had gone together, only to quickly turn back after her sighting. The bureaucrat he dealt with this time, a perspiring, overweight, middle-aged man, was openly skeptical of Evans, and particularly his reason for wanting to make such an expedition in the first place. "Recreation? Don't you find our athletic facilities and parks sufficient for recreation, Mr. Evans?" "Well, they're all excellent places, but the great outdoors has an appeal that can't be duplicated in the city. Open space." "And I'm afraid that's all you're going to find out there, but then I expect you already know that, since our records show that you and your wife were once granted a landscape visitation permit, she won't be accompanying you this time." "No, she passed away a few years ago," Evans said evenly, holding the bureaucrat's gaze.